We're in chapter 4, and chapter 4 is the chapter that begins to tell us things about the neshama that may not seem to make sense at first glance. And that's where things get really interesting, right? Because obviously whatever's predictable and whatever makes sense and whatever's logical to us, and we understand it, well, we don't need to learn Tanya in order to access the things that make sense to us and that we naturally understand. The greatness of learning this kind of work is the surprise element, the things that you get to discover that you would never, not only would you never have known, you would never intuit, you would never have guessed that such a thing is even possible. This is where we are in this chapter. The section where we start to talk about that, which nobody could have anticipated, because the story so far says this: you are a neshama. That's the first thing you have to know. That's who you really are. Yes, there may be various layers of coating, and because of those layers, you don't necessarily feel that you are a neshama. But that's the reality. The honest reality of who you are is neshama. What is the definition of a neshama? We already defined this in chapter 2. It is literally a piece of God that lives inside you. That's what it means to be a neshama. Now, it's all very well to say you are a neshama. It's a nice concept, it's a nice theory, but we have to appreciate what is a neshama and what does that do for me. So right at the beginning of our journey, we defined that there are 3 possible states, spiritual states that a person could be in. There's a state called tzaddik. Tzaddik is a super spiritual individual. We haven't begun to understand the nature of a tzaddik, and we only will much later on in the course of Tanya. On the opposite extreme, you have what is called a rasha. A rasha would indicate somebody who has disconnected from Hashem to a certain degree. And in order for a person to be a rasha, they don't necessarily have to be a villain, and they don't necessarily have to be a criminal. It just means somebody who occasionally doesn't do exactly what Hashem wants. That is a rasha. And floating somewhere in the middle is a very enigmatic reality called the Beinoni. And a big part of what Tanya is all about is to try and understand this Beinoni. What exactly is a Beinoni? What do we mean when we call somebody a Beinoni? Like, how does this work? So if you want to say you are a neshama, you have to understand, what does that mean? What does it mean you're a neshama? Is the rasha a neshama? Is only the tzaddik a neshama? What do we mean when we say these things? So we began a journey of discovery of what the soul is. And in that journey of discovery, what we said is, first of all, you have to know that the DNA of your soul is the DNA of God Himself, the DNA of infinite. Then we said, more specifically, your neshama operates in 10 different realities, 10 different spheres, 10 different expressions, what we call the koiches hanefesh, the powers of the soul. Part of that is intellectual. It allows us the opportunity to grasp godliness. Part of it is responsive and subjective. It allows us to build a relationship with Hashem. Remember, we're talking over here about the neshama, and the neshama's core objective is, how do I connect to God? So, when the neshama is thinking, it's thinking about God. When the neshama meditates, it meditates on God. When the neshama feels love, it is love towards God. This chapter told us that that's all very nice, but the neshama currently, in its current state, if you're sitting in this Tanya Shir, then the reality is that your neshama is sitting here on planet Earth. That's the reality. There may be neshamas that are learning Torah in heaven. As we know, there is a heavenly academy, so clearly they learn Torah in heaven as well. But currently, we're learning Torah where? Here on earth. That's our reality. If you want to live on earth, it's totally impractical to live on earth just as a neshama. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. Many have tried it and failed. One of 3 things happens. Either the neshama gets swallowed up by earth and the person becomes spiritually impotent, or what happens is the neshama gets so fed up with earth that it runs for the hills and the person dies, or the person cannot accommodate the reality of the neshama and the temptations of real life, so they go crazy. That's what happens. Neshamas don't really fit well into this world, so you need an interface. You need a system, you need a vehicle, you need tools that the neshama could use in order to be effective both in its experience of this world and, more importantly, in its influence on this world. That's this chapter. This chapter says, yes, it's true, your neshama is a piece of God. Yes, it's true, your neshama has 10 soul powers, and that's how it operates. The reality, though, is, in order for you to experience your neshama, in order for you to utilize your neshama in the most effective way, you have to know that your neshama also has what we call 3 garments, which effectively means 3 ways in which your neshama can interface with the world that you live in. Thought, speech, and action. And the minute you say that something is a garment, you have to think, in Judaism, the metaphors that we use are extremely carefully chosen. So if the metaphor is of a garment, that means that the operation of these particular elements are like garments. How does a garment work? You put it on, you wear it for a particular occasion. Comes the end of the day, you take it off, put on a different garment. In fact, you may even change your clothes more than once during the course of the day. In the morning, I'm going to gym. Got to wear gym clothes. After that, I got to go to shul. Shul, you got to wear shul clothes. After that, maybe I'm going to go to a business meeting. That's even more than shul clothes. I don't have to necessarily wear a tie to shul, but to go to a business meeting, I'll put on a tie. Then you come home at the end of the day, you want to get back into something comfortable. So how many times during the course of the day could a person change their clothing? It's quite something, right? Because ultimately clothes are disposable. Ultimately, clothes are not you. Ultimately, clothes are a means of how you allow yourself to be appropriate in different settings. In the shul, I look like this. In the gym, I look like that. At the business meeting, I look like that. And when I come home, I look like this. It's all about creating the appropriate interaction between me and the space. Same thing with the neshama. You think about something. You think about a deep concept in Judaism. So you're using the attribute of thought as a means of connection to Hashem. What happens when you finish thinking? What happens when you finish thinking? Now you've meditated on this particular principle for whatever it is. Let's say an hour, which in today's ADHD, 21st century world, anybody who could meditate on the same concept for 1 hour is clearly an anomaly. But let's say you do it. You focus for a complete hour. You don't check a single WhatsApp or anything like that. So now the hour's over. What's going to happen now? That's it. Now you switch off this garment. It is now currently not being used by the neshama. Instead, it's being used by the what's for supper thinking. It's also thought. It's the same garment, now being worn by somebody else. Or now it's a different type of thought that's using that garment. So you would imagine that thought, speech, and action are just necessary tools without which the neshama would be completely unproductive. So you've got to have them because for practical reasons. Practical reasons. In the same way as perhaps you have to have a driver's license for practical reasons. What happens if a person never has a driver's license in their life? Are they less human than somebody else? Is there some major piece of their life story that's missing? No, you could survive. You don't have a driver's license. Okay, whatever. It's a necessary thing. Unfortunately, the cities that we live in, if you want to commute, you have to be able to get from place A to place B. In order to do that, you have to have a license. Fine. But is it fundamental? Is it part of who I am? No, not necessarily. You have a garment. After a while, the garment gets shabby. You don't want to wear it anymore. So what do? No big deal. Pass it on, give it away, sell it to a thrift shop, whatever you do with it. So here's where things start to get very interesting, because we began last time by saying that what's unique about the garments of the soul is even though we call them garments, that was the expression the Alter Rebbe used, even though we call them garments, Gavo v'gadlo ma'ilosam le'ein kates, they have infinite greatness over the neshama itself. Now we have to understand how on earth that is possible. How could it be that the garments, which are effectively superficial, could somehow have greatness that the soul itself doesn't have? And in order to explain that, we need to understand what we don't understand. Now that was an ambiguous statement, right? What I mean to say is, we need to accept what we can never understand. Once we know that, it will help us on the path of understanding the greatness of the garments. So where we're going to start our conversation this evening is Kamosha Kosuv beZohar. We're going to start with a quotation from the Zohar, which of course is the centerpiece of all Jewish mysticism. It is the most valuable book of Kabbalah. What does it say in the Zohar? D'oraisa v'kucha brichu kula chad. Now, you have to remember that the Zohar is written in Aramaic, or at least as most of it is in Aramaic. And what's unusual about that is you don't necessarily recognize the words. So let's start first with just the words, what they mean. Kutsha brichu, you could probably hear in that, you can hear HaKadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He. Just sounds a little different. After all, Aramaic and Hebrew are technically cousin languages, so they look similar, but not exactly. HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Kutsha brichu. But what is Oraisa? What does that mean? What's the word Oraisa mean? So the word Oraisa means Torah. The word Torah comes from the word to teach, like a moira. What's a mora? A teacher, or a more in the masculine. It's a teacher. What is a hoira'ah? It's a lesson or a directive. So what is Torah? The book of teachings and directives. In Aramaic, you call it Oraisa. Same word, except what's nice about the Aramaic is that it has inside it the word or, which is light. So it already insinuates that there's more than just teaching and direction that comes from the Torah. There's light that comes from the Torah too. So what does the Zohar say? Oraisa, the Torah, ve'kucha brichu, and the Holy One, blessed be He, kulo chad, they're absolutely one. Now we have to understand, how could that be? Do you not notice that that's a paradoxical thing to say? As soon as we say it, it's an immediate paradox, because you're saying two things are one. By definition, that's contradictory. You call the one thing Torah, you call the other thing God, and then you tell me that they're one. That makes sense. If they're one, why do they have two names? So we've got to somehow understand, what do we mean when the Zohar tells us Oraisa ve'kucha brichu kolochad, that they're all one. Pirush, says the Alter Rebbe, what that means to tell us is that if you don't understand what Torah is, you can never answer this question. Not only can you never answer this question, how is the Torah and God one, but you can never appreciate what Torah is. You see, here's the thing. If you had to take a whole lot of people and put them into a room and say, describe to me, what is Torah? It'd be fascinating to see how many different answers you'd get. One person will tell you, what is Torah? Torah is a collection of the stories of Jewish history, the formative narratives that forged our nation, the creation, the flood, the patriarchs and matriarchs, the descent into an exodus from Egypt, the conquest of Israel, the establishment of the first Jewish state. That's what the Torah is. And as a result of that, if you learn the Torah, you'll know what it is to be Jewish. Are they wrong? Not wrong. It's factually accurate. You know what they say? You know what they say about the story of the group that was on a hot air balloon, and they got buffeted by the wind. You know, you have very little control over your navigation of a hot air balloon. So they got buffeted by the wind, and they landed up flying over a commercial area, and they actually had no idea where they were. So they were hovering over a corporate building, and they see a guy in the parking lot. So they shout down and they say, "Excuse me, we'd like to know, where are we? Can you tell us, where are we?" He says, "You're in a hot air balloon, approximately 100 meters above the ground." So the pilot of the hot air balloon turns to the rest of them. He says, "Oh, Baruch Hashem, I know exactly where we are." They said, "How do you know where we are?" He says, "We're directly over Microsoft headquarters." So how could you know we're over Microsoft headquarters from that information? He says, "Why? Because they gave me technically accurate, useless information. So that's how I know where we are." Right? So you can get technically accurate but useless information. It's technically accurate to say that the Torah incorporates within it the story of our early history and our heroes of Judaism, and from whom we should learn lessons. It's 100% true, and it's not necessarily helpful. So somebody else will come along and tell you, no, you're missing the point over here. The Torah is the legal guidebook for being Jewish. So how are you Jewish? These are the things you got to do. Every morning you got to pray to Hashem, and then you got to wear certain types of clothes, and you've got to have markings on your doors to remind you there's a God, and then you've got to stop working once a week as a statement of faith, and then every once in a while you've got to have a strange holiday where either you can't eat what you want, or you can't eat where you want, or you have to eat things you don't want, or you just don't eat at all. So it's the guidebook. It effectively tells you how to practice as a Jew. Is that accurate? Is it accurate? Absolutely. Accurate information. Has it captured what the Torah is? How is that different to the constitution of the country you live in? How is that different to the traffic rules? They also tell you the rules by which you have to live when you're on the road. What's Torah about this? It's the same kind of question that you could ask about the cultural heritage, historical perspective. Okay, every culture has its story. Every culture has its heroes. Every culture has its role models. What's unique about Torah? So we're missing the point, right? So people will tell you, no, you have to understand. And now we're getting warmer. It's like one of those children's games. You're starting to get warmer. So now somebody will tell you, no, you have to understand what differentiates Torah from every other kind of history, philosophy, legal work, ethical guide is the fact that this is Hashem's Torah. This is not a human anthology of ideas. This is divine wisdom. This is divine wisdom that was presented with thunder and lightning and shaking, and the whole world was turned upside down because God himself descended on Sinai and said, I am the Lord your God, and here's what you got to do about it. Are they right? Absolutely right. This is a totally different perspective. This is a differentiator. This is the kind of thing that the Hellenists fought against the Maccabees over. Because the Hellenists insisted that the Jews have wisdom, and the Hellenists, the Greek Empire, had wisdom. And you have great philosophers, and we have great philosophers. And you have your insight into the workings of the world, and we have our scientists. And we're all the same, just, in different ways. And they were very offended by the fact that the Jewish people kept insisting, no, we're not the same actually. Because the Torah is divine wisdom, and you're learning about Aristotle and Archimedes. It's not the same, lahavdil. It's not the same. And the moment we say that the Torah is divine wisdom, we're a whole lot warmer, we're a whole lot closer to understanding what the Torah is, but we're not there yet. And this is the thing, you see, when a person is way, way off the mark, sometimes that is a safer place to be than the person who's just a little off the mark. Because what happens? What happens if somebody's completely off the mark? If somebody had to walk over to you and tell you that they believe that the Torah is nothing more than the historical record of the Jewish people and some ethical guidelines that were relevant in ancient times but are completely, they're old-fashioned now. You would know clearly that these people are off the wall. You would know clearly that this is in an inappropriate way to speak. You would know absolutely that Judaism would reject outright that suggestion. If somebody had to walk in and tell us, Chaza has now got the hechsher, it's now got the authorization of some Beth Din somewhere, you'd say, you're nuts. It's not possible. But the moment you're just almost there, but not quite, that's where a person says, okay, but I'm there, right? Because I've now made the shift. I've now understood that the Torah is not just simply a collection of wisdom or laws or historical facts, but it's divine wisdom. I've crossed the threshold. You have, but do you know what it means to say it's divine wisdom? What does that mean? Because our problem, it's a human problem, and we all suffer from it. Our problem is we are impulsively projecting ourselves onto the world around us all the time. That's our problem. We don't even realize that we're doing it. Right? We don't realize that we're doing it. So we keep projecting ourselves and saying, it's divine wisdom. Divine, I don't quite understand what that is, but I know what wisdom is. So basically, if it's divine wisdom, in all likelihood, what that means is it's the wisdom I'm familiar with taken to an extreme. Imagine if you could take the greatest wisdom. Imagine if you could take Einstein and Copernicus and Galileo and all of them and roll them into one and multiply that by 1 billion. Maybe that's divine wisdom. In other words, what we do is, and it's a consistent human error, what we do is when we try to understand God, we take things we're familiar with and stretch them to the extreme and say, and that's how it is for God. So if we say God is infinite, we think that means very, very big. So big you can't even tell how big he is. Because in our world, big is impressive. So if he's infinite, he must be really big. And in our world, kind is impressive. So he must be really kind. And in our world, wisdom is impressive. So you must be so smart. You know how smart God is? God is so smart that after thousands of years of humans exploring and trying to understand the nature of his world, we're still just scratching the surface and we have more questions than answers. And we discover more questions than we discover answers. That's how smart. That's divine wisdom. You want divine wisdom? Go into the Torah. And then you'll find the answer to black holes, and you'll find the cure for COVID, and you'll find the way to deal with economic crises and how to keep families together. It's all in the Torah because it's the greatest wisdom. So the smartest doctor you could ever ask, there's a smarter doctor in the pages of the Talmud. And the greatest philosopher you could ever encounter, there's a greater philosopher hidden within the text of the Torah. And that's a mistake. Because all that means is a projection of the human experience onto how we would like to define the Torah. Enter the Zohar. The Zohar says, the Torah is not infinite divine wisdom and leave it at that. Oraisa v'kutsha brichu kulo chad. The Torah and God are absolutely one. Kulo chad. It is completely one. What does that mean? Pirush, what does that mean? Firstly, it means Doraisa he, that the definition of Torah is, so now that we have, thank God, removed some of those weaker definitions, the Torah is not just a collection of legal matters for Jews. And it's not just the record of some of the highlight stories of Jewish history, because many of the stories clearly were left out. You can see the gaps in the story. What is Torah? Hi chachmasoi uretzoinoi shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The correct definition of Torah is that it is the wisdom and the will of God. Now, at this point in time, you say, but isn't that what you just said? You just said that the Torah is divine wisdom, and then you said that that's not good enough. So, but here, the Zohar just said that that's what it is. It's divine wisdom. Yes, don't project just yet. At this point in time, we hear the word wisdom, and without realizing it, subconsciously, we immediately ascribe, oh, wisdom, that's the stuff I have. I also have wisdom. I don't have as much wisdom, but I have a little bit of wisdom. It's on the wisdom scale. I'm at the bottom of the wisdom scale, and God is at the top of the wisdom scale. And that's why sometimes I feel God's got it wrong, because you know what? At least the little bit of wisdom that I have tells me that God's, he should have thought this through. What was he thinking? Choose a people and then make them suffer for the whole of history. God, did you think this one through? So chokhmasoi, we have to understand what that means to say that it is Hashem's wisdom. But then we say more than that, ritzoinoi. We say that the Torah is God's will. What do we mean by God's will? God's will does not mean things that Hashem would appreciate if you did. He'd appreciate it. That's not God's will. God's will means things that are so deeply rooted in the essence of what God is all about, that as a result of that, these things have to happen. That's God's will. We can use human experience just to try and understand what that means. So let's use an example. let's say, I know some people are very nervous because it's been weeks and weeks and weeks of a Tanya show without a single chocolate reference, so we have to use at least one chocolate reference. So let's say that there's a person who wants to have chocolate. You want to have chocolate. Is that a ratzoin? Is that a deep-seated motivation, will of who you are, or is it a whimsical, I'd like to have? It's the latter, right? Because what happens if you go over to your pantry and open the door and discover that there is no chocolate? And Nebuch, it's so late that everywhere is closed and you can't even get any chocolate. So what do? Well, tomorrow's another day. Maybe a little bit more irritable. Maybe you try and find an alternative, but you survive. Because at the end of the day, that is not rotzoin. The definition of rotzoin is something that by virtue of who I am, this has to be. So let's say, by virtue of the fact that I am, let's just say that you're a person who is an extremely compassionate person. By virtue of who you are, if you're robbed of the opportunity to be good to people, if you have to isolate because there's this pandemic in the world and they lock you up in your house for weeks or months on end, you feel like there's a whole chunk of you missing because by virtue of who I am as a compassionate person, I need to share compassion. And if you rob me of that opportunity to share compassion, you're robbing me of my soul. It's not just a thing on a bucket list. It's who I am expressed in the things that I care about. So what is the Torah? The Torah is divine wisdom, which we're about to define. And once we do define it, we'll appreciate it's something completely different to any wisdom we're familiar with. And beyond wisdom, it is a description of the things that by virtue of what God is, these things have to be. So for example, let's use any mitzvah. Let's say that there's a mitzvah to eat kosher. Why should you eat kosher? Well, because it's healthy. Yeah, some chachamim over the course of time try to argue the health argument in favor of kosher. I don't know if they ever had cholent in their life. And anybody who claims that the kashrus is all about, what are you talking about? You could be the most unhealthy person in the world and completely glut kosher. It's not related. So why do you keep kosher? Because I live in the 21st century and I was told that one of the most important things to do in the 21st century is mindful eating. Instead of just eating as some kind of an arbitrary, chewing experience, it's a mindful experience. You should be conscious of the food. You should be conscious of your palate. You should be conscious of the chewing. You should be conscious of the swallowing. And all of it should be some kind of a meaningful experience. Okay, gesundheit. Have a nice time. It has nothing to do with Torah. So why do I keep kosher? Because by virtue of what God is, there has to be kosher. Understand what that means? I'm not doing it to rack up some points so that one day when I get upstairs, he pulls out my record and says, I'm very impressed. You ate kosher for so many years. For someone like you, do we have a cholent waiting? That's not the idea. Why should I keep kosher? Because by virtue of what God is, there has to be kosher. That's what we mean by ratzoin. Now, we're going to develop that further, of course, as we go. But before we do that, let's go back to Chokhmah. We said that Torah is first and foremost Hashem's wisdom. And in the course of studying His wisdom, we also discover His ratzon. So what do we mean when we describe God's wisdom? Ve'hakadosh Baruch Hu bichvoidoi uve'atzmoi kulo chad. Well, the nature of Hashem is absolutely different to the nature of anything that we are familiar with, because the nature of Hashem is that kavoidoi, His glory, ve'atzmoi, and His self or His essence, kulochad, are all one. Okay, what on earth does that mean? When last did you use the word glory in a sentence? Right? I think it went out with the Beatles. You know what I mean? It's I don't think people use that language anymore, except in Torah. The same people who describe tefillin as phylacteries use the word glory, God's glory. Okay, we don't know what we're talking about. So the word kavod, which interestingly enough in the Gemara is related to clothing. Clothing is called mechabdusa, that which brings honor to a person. And if you think about it, it's quite logical, because at the end of the day, when you put on clothing, that's what gives you rank and file in the community. So you put on a suit, and people think, oh, this is a serious individual. You put on a police uniform, you're a representative of the authorities. You put on a long black coat, and they say, oh, religious Jew. Right? Every different uniform that you have brings a certain degree of honor to the person. You put on a blue overall, and everybody thinks, okay, whatever, you're not a very productive member of society. So clothing have the potential to create honor. We've just discussed the idea of levush, that the garments of the soul are pretty much superficial to the soul. But here's the irony. Mechabdusa. They add value. And this is where we're going to start to pivot. We're going to start to shift our thinking that thought, speech, and action may just be tools which are quite external to the soul. And yet they're going to elevate the soul, and we'll discover how. But before we do that, let's compare how the clothing, the kavod, the outer, so to speak, prestige of a person compares to the essence of the same person. Let's start there. Now, these are words that, again, as much as we don't use the word glory, we don't necessarily use the word essence. So let's understand. Here in South Africa, and I'm sure it's happened in other places in the world as well, there have been quite a number of crime incidents where the perpetrators are wearing police uniforms. Now, anybody who's familiar with the nature of South Africa will know that that's a double irony, because on the one hand, it could be people who stole police uniforms in order to get away with committing crimes, or it could be that that's the nature of the police force. Either one is possible. But the point being that here you've got on the outside, you've got somebody wearing a uniform that gives you the impression that they are to be trusted, that they represent the law, and that they care about you, because those are the ideals of a police officer. That's the external, the so-called kavod, the part that is radiated, because kavod also means something which radiates or glows. So this is the part of the person that is radiated to the public eye. Who's the etzem? Who's the essence of the person? Criminal. And that's the nature of clothing. Clothing can disguise you. One of the best ways to disguise a person is to dress them in a way that looks innocuous. Like everybody always says, didn't look like a con man. Well, what do con men look like? Do they walk around with one of those tags that says, hi, my name is Joe and I'm a con man? Obviously the way that they dress is that they're con men. The whole way that they dress is to gain your confidence. So the disguise is what makes the disparity between the kavod, the external, what brings them respect, and the etzem, who they really are. Now that's a dramatic example, because we're talking about a total dissonance between the inside and the outside of a person. Let's make it a little less dramatic and talk about our experiences. So in our experience, we will, in a completely healthy way, have parts of ourselves that are more superficial and parts of ourselves that are more essential to who we are. A great example of that, of course, is how we conduct ourselves in a formal space. So let's just say that you're at a formal event, and the way that you have to behave at the formal event is that you're supposed to sit, obviously, with your back straight and tuck your napkin, into your top button, and eat with a knife and fork at the correct angles, and your pinky sticking out when you drink tea, and all that kind of thing. And you could do it perfectly, because that's the expectation of the setting. And then you come home after that, kick off your shoes, sprawl on the couch, break open a beer, and eat popcorn straight out of the bag. Are you now some kind of a hypocrite? You're not a hypocrite. There are times where you have to express your way in a bakavadika, in a distinguished, dignified manner. And there are other times you could just be you. And the whole of human experience is the balancing act between kvoidoi and atzmoi. The whole human experience is knowing when it's appropriate to really be me and when it's appropriate to step back and put on the facade. Because you know what the reality is? A good portion of the people who say, hello, how are you? Don't want to know. So you put on the kavod and you say, fine, thank you, and you. And then they say, fine, thanks, and you. And you do it about 6 times and then you move on. You could criticize the society for being superficial and you could cry about the fact that nobody really cares, but that doesn't fundamentally make you a bad person. It is a social convention. You ask people how they are, then you respond, you move on, because nobody really wants to know your story. Now, what happens if somebody says, how are you? And you tell them. Yes? It's like that, I don't know about you, but I don't have a fear of flying. Thank God. I don't have a fear of flying, but I have an absolute fear of the passenger next to me. Because God forbid I should sit next to somebody who loves to talk. Like the best thing about a plane is they close the doors, you switch off your phone, nobody can disturb you, you can read, you can sleep, you can catch up. Somebody sits next to you and they start telling you about all the surgeries that they've had. This is what I paid this money for. I paid good money to sit on a plane to listen to this. Kvoidoi and atzmoi. Sometimes it's got to be kavod, sometimes it's got to be atzmoi. Sometimes you share yourself, sometimes you don't share yourself. It's the reality of being human. It's appropriate. It gets even more subtle than that, you see, because that's still talking about how I relate to others versus how I relate internally within myself. The truth is, even within myself, there's kvoidoi and atzmoi. Let's say that you study, whatever it is. Let's say that you're a highly intellectual individual. So at night, for fun, you sit down and you read, Plato for fun. So is that your etzem? Is that who you are? Or is this kavoidoi? Is this part of what makes you feel good, distinguished, stimulated, satisfied? It's more subtle. But the truth of the matter is, that even a person's intellect, as advanced as it might be, does not necessarily have to be atzmoi, who you are. There's who I am, and what I learn or meditate on or contemplate or think about or innovate. And they're not always the same. And that's not some kind of split personality. It's normal human experience. There is me, who I am, and then there's me, the great professor. And sometimes the great professor will be on the floor playing with Lego with his grandchild, and that's who he is. Your great assets and accolades don't always define you. They define aspects of you. And Hashem is fundamentally different to that, because kavoidoi ve'atzmoi kulo chad. There is no distinction between the God that is shared and the God that is in essence. In humans, it is that way. If I'm sharing with you, I'll share what I share and not all of me. There will always be a disparity between me and what I share, including what I share with myself through intellect or through emotion. In Hashem's case, and we cannot begin to fathom what that looks or feels like, it is all absolutely one. There is no disparity. And to explain it, the Alter Rebbe borrows words straight out of the Rambam. And what's fascinating about this is that the Rambam does not quote these words in his philosophical works like Moreh HaNevuchim, the Guide to the Perplexed, but instead he quotes these words in his legal work, Mishnah Torah, which is the law of how a Jewish person is supposed to believe. Fascinating, right? Telling us that this information is core to Judaism. It's not just something to talk about in your philosophy circle. This is the bread and butter of Judaism. So what does the Rambam say? Ki hu hayodeya. God is the knower, capital K. The knower of everything. The knower in essence. The knower in the most absolute way that you could know. Vehu hamada. And he is the technology of knowing. How's that for a thought? He is the knower and the technology of knowing, the means of knowing. Okay, right now that's a little abstract. Luckily, the Alter Rebbe for us then puts v'chulei, etc. He leaves it at that. The Rambam includes another element to it, which is hayodua, that Hashem is that which is known as well. But we're not going to get into that at this point in time, because we've already achieved what we need to achieve, to know that Hashem is the knowledge and the knower. It's something, says the Alter Rebbe, that he already very briefly quoted earlier in the Rambam's name. This is revolutionary information, you see, because, and I'm going to use a terrible example only because it really, really illustrates the point. What would happen if there was a person who in their prime was a leading intellectual in whichever field, in the arts, the sciences, whatever it is, a leading intellectual that the world fell head over heels for them. Anything that they would say, everybody would run to hear. What would happen if that person, God forbid, reached a phase in their life where they developed dementia and they were unable to share a meaningful sentence or remember anything of intellectual value? It'd be a tragedy, right? Let's make the story worse. What if you had somebody who was this brilliant intellect and God forbid they were involved in some kind of an accident and left comatose? Is this person now less of a person? We dare suggest such a thing. That puts us on the brink of murder. Because if we believe that somebody whose function is diminished is now less of a person, then we start with this whole business of deciding that these people deserve to live and those people don't deserve to live, and that's a slippery slope. So any ethical person will acknowledge that somebody who has lost functionality, somebody who has lost the brilliance that they once had, what they have lost is their brilliance. They have not lost them. And that's why it's an axiom of Judaism that a living person is considered 100% like the next living person when it comes to questions of termination of life, God forbid. Quality of life can increase or decrease without making life more alive or less alive. Why is that? Because, at least in the context of our conversation, there are many layers to this, but in the context of our conversation, because in our reality, we are the yodeya, not the means of knowing. We are the sentient beings who use a technology called intellect in order to be able to process knowledge. When that intellectual tool ceases to function, they can no longer process intellect. But they were never the intellect. And they were never the knowledge. So remove the intellect from them and even cripple the knowledge in them, and you haven't touched them yet. Because they were not the knowledge and they were not the intellect. That's a big difference between being human and being God. In Hashem's case, it's all 100% one. The knowledge and the knower. There is no distinction. Can we understand that? No. And the Alter Rebbe will spell that out for us, and he'll say that actually it is not possible to understand. But that we'll do, please God, next week.